Why does education disadvantage dyspraxia students? Or does education disadvantage dyspraxia students? Is there something that the educational system is not telling you? And is that something a disservice to people with dyspraxia? Is that something a disservice to people that are neurodivergent? Now, the educational system is favourable to people that are neurotypical. This makes sense because the majority of people are neurotypical. But does this not put people with dyspraxia and people that are neurodivergent at a significant disadvantage? Does the educational system have problems? And how can these problems be fixed? Is there an economic problem with regards to budgets? And let's be honest, the world has an economic problem, but that's a different issue. But of course, if this premise is true, there are still solutions. And we will look at the problems and we will look at the solutions. So let's go to whiteboard animation. Now here is an important premise. There are many human beings that think in words, and there are some human beings that think in pictures. This central theme will be an important part of the dyspraxia education discussion. Now, further to this premise is the notion that picture-thinking human beings are more likely to be neurodivergent. And if this is the case, does the education system give people with dyspraxia a fair chance? I feel that this story needs to be told. So let's analyze this train of thought accordingly. So before we talk about education and dyspraxia, I think it's important that we lay a foundation. And I think there's a simple question to ask here. And that question is, what is my credibility and experience towards this situation? Alternatively, you can ask, is there any experience or credibility with regards to this subject? So to answer this, I'm going to break it down into 3 phases. So phase 1, let's talk about dyspraxia. So I have been diagnosed with dyspraxia on 2 separate occasions. The first occasion, I was diagnosed by an educational psychologist, and the second occasion, I was diagnosed by an educational psychologist. So I have 2 formal diagnoses of dyspraxia. So this, I feel, gives me some form of credibility and definitely some experience with regards to talking about this issue. So now let's move on to phase 2, which is education. And I want to give a quick disclaimer. I was not a good student by any stretch of the imagination, but objectively, I was a student for a considerable period of time. Of course, the term good is subjective, but that's a deflection from what I'm trying to say. So the obvious question is, what is my university experience? To define it in simple terms, I have completed a degree, I have completed 2 postgraduate degrees, and I also have completed a master's degree. So even though we can argue that I may not be a good student or may not be an outstanding student, we can definitely argue that I have a length of experience with regards to education. And I think we can argue that that's important because I've experienced education in different university institutions. This, to a certain degree, gives me knowledge on education. Again, we can say that there's lived experience when we talk about education. And now let's move on to phase 3. And this is about my social enterprise, neuroexpression. And the first question would be, why is that relevant? Well, neuroexpression is relevant because it's a social enterprise that empowers neurodivergent people. To completely simplify this, neuroexpression empowers neurodivergent people, neurodivergent artists, and neurodivergent communities. At the very least, that's the intention. and neuroexpression is a social enterprise. That means the emphasis is on social benefit as opposed to money. In contrast, a business, typically an LLC, the emphasis would be to make money. As this social enterprise concerns neurodivergence and dyspraxia, this again gives me knowledge and credibility to speak on this subject. Of course, one could beg to differ, because let's face it, life is subjective. But this is my experience and this is my credibility. So with that being said, let's talk about dyspraxia in education. Now, are people with dyspraxia disadvantaged at school? It's a good question. But I would argue that if we're going to understand that if people with dyspraxia are disadvantaged at school, we need to answer the following question. And that question primarily is, how do teachers teach information, or how does the school, or how do schools produce information? So we're going to break this down fundamentally into two categories. Now, we could elaborate on these categories. For example, we could break it down into 7 categories, but this would make the information less concise. And if the information presented is less concise, that to me means it would be more confusing. So like Shakespeare says, to be or not to be, there are only 2 options to that question. So these 2 categories are the following: verbal thinking and visual thinking. Now, verbal thinking is primarily written communication, or should I say is expressed through written communication, and it's effectively thinking in words. But visual thinking is different, because visual thinking is thinking visually. Think of flowcharts, mind maps, video explainers, illustrations, etc. Now, the school system, or the educational system, particularly in the Western context, I would say revolves around verbal thinking. Exams consist of verbal thinking because the questions are presented in written form. There are no visuals. And think of multiple choice. Again, these multiple sets of answers are presented in written form. And books, which are in educational institutions, again, are primarily presented in text or written form. Shakespeare is in text. Einstein is in text. Socrates is in text. Now, of course, there may be some separate educational institutions that may adopt a different approach. But I think the assumption is quite solid that most educational institutions revolve or cater for verbal thinking. And if educational institutions cater for verbal thinking, by default, that means they're not catering for visual thinking. So what is visual thinking? This is a good question. Visual thinking can be thinking in forms such as flowcharts and mind maps. It can also be storyboarding. So let's distinguish the difference between a flowchart and a mind map. It's funny because I initially was struggling to answer that question. So in simple terms, a flowchart illustrates a process. So let me give you a personal example. So years ago, I was struggling on learning how to cook. I just couldn't get my head around it. So what I did, I actually prepared a flowchart. And one of those flowcharts was making a curry. So basically it was just illustrating that process. Step 1, step 2, step 3, step 4, step 5, etc. So in this context, the flowchart aided me in being able to cook because it showed a process that I could relate to. So that's a flowchart. But what is a mind map? In simple terms, a mind map is a visual diagram which shows ideas around a particular concept. So again, let's give a personal example. So for my social enterprise, neuroexpression, I create mind maps. And those mind maps will detail the various projects that I'm working on. So I'm applying for a grant, phase 1. I'm waiting on a decision on another grant, that's phase 2. We have approached an organization about doing a guest talk, that's phase 3. I'm in talks with a gallery concerning an exhibition, that's phase 4. And we're setting up a meeting with another organization, that's phase 5. I'm assuming you get the picture. So this to me would be a mind map. And this is another example of visual thinking. And because I use mind maps and flowcharts, that's why I would consider myself a visual thinker. Let's briefly mention storyboarding. Now, storyboarding is probably a more complex way of compiling information. Typically, storyboarding is associated with movies. So you would use a storyboard to plan out a movie. But it can also be used for other forms of visual expression. For example, in theory, a storyboard could map out a particular project. So to conclude this section, visual thinking can be expressed through flowcharts, mind maps, and storyboarding. So why? Why does the educational system have a preference for verbal thinking? This is an essential question. If we can answer this question, then perhaps we can understand the context. So in simple terms, traditional teaching methods were verbal. So reading, writing, and speaking are all part of the verbal thinking matrix. Think of this. When you go into a library, what do? When you go into the university library, typically you're looking for books. You search for books on the database and you physically look for books on the shelf. Now let's say you're writing a 2,000 word assignment. That 2,000 word assignment would typically have what you call a bibliography. And that bibliography would consist of books. This is standardized practice. So from this perspective, what can we gather? Well, we can come to the understanding that verbal thinking is just an inherent part of the educational system. It's an inherent part of the system of learning. And let's be clear, there is nothing wrong with verbal thinking, and there is nothing wrong with verbal learning. However, to be inclusive, there should be visual thinking. And that means we need some visual learning. Here's another point that I think is important to make. Books and verbal thinking are parts of the culture. For example, religious books are written in text. You have the culture of the bookstore, and a bookstore with books is geared for verbal thinking. Now, of course, in modern society, there has been an introduction to other things that are more tailored towards visual thinking. The popular social media YouTube has content which consists of visual learning or visual thinking. And in truth, these social media platforms consist of verbal thinking and visual thinking. But there is a history of libraries and there is a history of education. And this history shows a preference for verbal thinking. Here's a question. Aren't books the cornerstone of education? If that premise is true, then we can see the verbal thinking preference. It's no wonder that the packaging of education has a direct preference for verbal thinkers. So there is a very important question to address. And that question is, are neurodivergent people visual thinkers? Alternatively, we could ask, are the majority of neurodivergent people visual thinkers? I'm hoping at this point that we've established what neurodivergence is and we know what visual thinking is. And considering this, I'm not going to define those terms. So is there any evidence to clarify this premise? And that premise is, are neurodivergent people visual thinkers? Is there any logic to clarify this premise? And when I say logic, we can refer to basic syllogism. What is syllogism? Let me just give you a quick example from the internet. All men are mortal. Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. That's a very quick example of syllogism. But I feel like we're deflecting a bit, so let's get back to the program. Are neurodivergent people visual thinkers? Well, let's provide some anecdotal evidence. So Temple Grandin has written about visual thinking, and she's an autistic professor that thinks in pictures. She actually talks about the difference between visual thinking, verbal thinking, and makes that correlation between neurodivergent thinkers and visual thinkers. I'm paraphrasing, by the way, that's not a direct quote. Now, we also have some research in autism. And in this research, it shows that people that have autism, they actually outperform others in visual tasks. And the context for the others would be people that are neurotypical. We also have research from the Dyspraxia Institute. This research suggests that people with dyslexia are strong visual thinkers. There's an important categorization there. Not only are they visual thinkers, they are strong visual thinkers. So we can conclude this part by stating the following. We have a neurodivergent professor that is a visual thinker. We have neurodivergent individuals that outperform others in visual tasks. We have dyslexia research that shows that people with dyslexia are strong visual thinkers. This shows a pattern that neurodiverse people are visual thinkers. And just to clarify, people with dyspraxia are neurodiverse, meaning they are also visual thinkers. So I think there's a lot of information that shows that neurodivergent people are visual thinkers, and therefore people with dyspraxia are visual thinkers because they are part of the neurodivergent family. So here is an important point to consider. If neurodiverse people are visual thinkers and we are not engaging visual learning, that means neurodivergent people will not be able to flourish in the educational system. If visual thinking is neglected, neurodivergent people will not be given a fair chance in the educational system. And a fair opportunity is essential in a fair society. If we don't accommodate visual thinking, are we a fair society in the educational context? So how can education engage with visual thinkers? How do we engage visual thinking in the educational context? It's an important question, and here are some suggestions. Suggestion number 1, visual note-taking. This encourages and teaches students visual note-taking techniques that are sketches. These combine doodles, symbols and text. The cost implications are small, but there is a learning curve. Suggestion number 2, interactive simulations and virtual labs. This allows students to visualize and interact. This is ideal for visual thinking, but the downside is the potential cost implications. Suggestion number 3, flowcharts. This is ideal for students to visualize, connect and organize ideas. There is a learning curve with this option. Suggestion number 4, visual storytelling. Create storyboards to represent events. This would be ideal for history, literature and politics. Now there's a small cost implication, but there's a larger learning curve with this option. And finally, suggestion number 5, visual learning centers. This is the utilization of visual materials. Think of models and puzzles as a method of teaching. This would have some high cost implications, but could be very effective. So as we can see, There are various ways to engage in visual learning, and there are more ways to engage in visual learning. These different visual learning techniques have different cost implications. It's also important to acknowledge that a learning curve is still a cost implication, because when a company has an induction, that is a cost incurred by the company. So additional learning means additional cost. So let's conclude this part by saying the following. We can have visual learning. We should have visual learning, but also we must have visual learning to engage neurodivergent thinkers. The question then becomes, what is the cost of not having visual learning? Ask yourself that question. So before we conclude, let's acknowledge the following. There are some institutions that do engage in visual learning, so let's acknowledge them. So number one, there's the Montessori schools. Apologies if I've mispronounced that. And they use visual aids to help understanding. They use physical materials. For example, they use a pink tower of 10 blocks, utilizing the senses of seeing and touching. Number two, you have Waldorf schools. Again, apologies if the pronunciation is wrong. And they promote visual learning utilizing drawing, painting, and sculpting. They also used visual storytelling. Interestingly, they promote the idea of using illustration to enforce concepts in a visual way. And finally, example 3, we have design thinking programs, and these are part of certain schools. These promote mind maps, flowcharts, and storyboards to solve problems and to harness creativity. I also want to add that there are a lot of things that, in my experience, the educational system gets right, and this is diagnosing neurodivergence, supporting neurodivergence by having a dedicated faculty, and in some circumstances having some type of professional that provides guidance to remove the barriers of the disability. These are positive things and they should be acknowledged. So in conclusion, I want to make the following statements. So statement number 1, verbal thinking is just an inherent part of education. Statement number 2, a complete focus on verbal thinking disadvantages visual thinking. Statement number 3, many neurodivergent people are neurodivergent thinkers. Statement number 4, because dyspraxia is a part of the neurodivergent family, people with dyspraxia are likely to be visual thinkers. Statement number 5, visual thinking is predominantly flowcharts, mind maps, and storytelling. Statement number 6, there are other visual thinking methods, therefore visual thinking is multifarious. Statement number 7, we need to support visual thinkers to support neurodivergent learners. And finally, statement number 8, in my opinion, education, including visual thinking, is an adjustment. It's a reasonable adjustment that is absolutely necessary. So thank you for watching the content, and I sincerely hope that this video provided value. If you want to support the channel, like, subscribe, and watch the content. And additionally, there is a free PDF called What is Dyspraxia? This PDF is linked to my social enterprise called Neuro Expression. Link in the description.